Day one of music class. Today I'm just going to be going over basic stuff you need to know when starting out. You know, just like basic things you need to do when making a song, get a clean mix down, and everything you need to know that's pretty much essential for producing electronic music. So, one thing that is probably the most important thing in making music is organization. So you always want to have stuff where you want it, stuff where you, so you know where everything is. So, like, for instance, say I want to have some drums, you would want to color code them. Like, for instance, I always make my drums gray, and I also always group them. It doesn't really matter how you group it, but I group it in, like, kicks and snares as one group, melodic stuff is one group, like, hi-hats, effects, white noise, that's all one group, and I have one color set to each of those. You want to do something like that. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as mine, but you want to have your own little system so you can navigate quickly and it'll make your workflow a whole lot faster. Next thing we're going to go over is low cutting stuff and having your sub cut through cleanly. This is something that a lot of people, especially when starting out, struggle with, but there's a very simple way and consistent way to do it because it's pretty universal for all tracks, because sub tends to take around the same area of frequency. So, for example, let's just get like a random saw chord thingy. Okay, so now under this we would usually have a separate sub, which is on the root note of your chord, and you would want to use, it doesn't really matter what instrument you use for your sub. I prefer operator because I think it sounds cleaner, but as long as you have some kind of synth that uses a sine wave or any basic shapes, you'll be fine. I'm just going to be using operator for this because it's what I'm used to and it's what I like using. You also want to make sure your sub is on around an octave around this, like around this octave, or C0, but for C is actually an exception. You would want that to be on 1, but usually you would want your sub note to be on a 0, on the 0 octave in Ableton. I think in FL Studio,
a better tip would be from like the frequency range of like 40 to 80 or so.
40 to 80, yeah, 40 to 80 to 120.
Yeah, that's
around that range. I think in FL the octave is 2 for sub.
Yeah, it is.
But for notes below E or D sharp, you would actually want to go an octave up because at that point it's basically inaudible. So since C is below E, I actually have it on C1 instead of C0. So just like that. The way you would actually EQ a sub or go about making a sub is actually by, first thing you would want to do if you're making heavy stuff. I just want to point that out. This is for heavy stuff. If you're making like chill, lo-fi stuff, you probably don't want to do this. What you would do is you would take some kind of saturator. I'm just going to use Ableton's saturator, and you would turn up the drive quite a bit until it's around, like you see this number right here. You want to make sure that's around -5 for a midsection or -3 for a drop. But that can also be pretty dependent on the song you're making, but you just want to have that sort of average mindset in there. And now, next thing you would do, obviously, since we saturated this, it's obviously going to add a lot of high-end harmonics, so we are going to need to EQ this. Like, if you see that. Wait, did I do this right? Yeah. You also, another tip for doing heavy stuff, or anything, you tend to want to use either a triangle or a square. Sine can be good sometimes, especially with like the more chill stuff, but for heavy stuff you want to use either a square or a saw. So I'm going to use a square for this, and as you can see, as soon as I make it a square, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on over here in the high end, which you don't want in a sub. So what you would do is you would create a low pass, put it pretty steep, not a brick wall. Don't want a brick wall stuff unless you absolutely have to. And I tend to put it at around, really depends on the key you're in, because you want to have it at like the highest, frequency you get in your sub. But I'm just going to put it at around 100. And you also want to have a slight high pass at like 15 hertz. So your EQ for your sub should pretty much always look something like this. That way it's clean and you don't get high frequencies from your sub clashing with other stuff. And if we turn this back on, it sounds kind of clean, but it could be cleaner, because if we look at this on an analyzer, as you can see, there's lots of low end stuff in here, which is not good because we already have a sub in the low end, which is the only thing that should be punching through in that frequency range besides your kick and snare. So if you have a sound like this, where there's lots of stuff down here, you want to create a high pass, and this is something that's pretty universal. I always put it at 120 hertz, and already sounds a lot cleaner because there's no sub coming from this anymore.
Hey, Ry3.
Yeah?
People are asking what if you could elaborate on why you cut off 15 hertz on the sub.
Because usually stuff down there, the stuff down there is pretty inaudible anyways, and it's can also cause issues in the rest of your low end if you have too much in there. So it's kind of like a safety measure, something you want to do just in case something goes wrong.
Another reason behind it is the human ear cannot hear below 30 hertz.
However,
that doesn't mean it's obsolete. Certain club speakers can still produce it to where it does become a frequency you feel. But however, the lower down the frequency spectrum you go, the more energy you're taking up. So especially for newer mixes and stuff, you're going to be freeing your mix of you're going to be creating a lot of headroom for yourself by doing that. And audibly, it won't make like a difference on things like headphones and stuff.
Next thing I want to go over is sidechaining. Now, there's a lot of methods for doing this, but I tend to do it with volume automation because it's just more accurate in my opinion, but though some people do it with compression, some people do the high end and the low end separately.
And can you explain what sidechaining is and why it's important?
I should probably explain what sidechaining is. Basically, what sidechaining is whenever you have a kick or snare, everything else will duck out of the way for a brief second for the exact amount of time that your kick or snare is taking up. So your kicks and snares will be super, super frontal. So the way you'd go about doing that, let me find a random kick real quick. Yeah, let's just take this one. So if we have a kick like this, we obviously want to make sure the transient's pretty long. For this kick, I would tend to make this tail a little bit shorter, like this stuff where there's like a little bit of wave but not really much. I tend to cut that off because that tends to mud up my low end a little bit, especially towards the end of a kick. So I would cut that off at around here. Yeah, like around there. Maybe not that much. Yeah, probably around there. So you would have this. Maybe a little longer than that. So yeah, next thing you would do, in Ableton, what you would do is you would group everything. So you would select 2 tracks by holding Shift and you can Control G. And next thing I would do is show the volume automation for your group. And what you would do next is you want to try and create a sidechain shape that roughly matches the form of your kick. And the way you want to go about doing that is create a automation thing that goes for around the length of your kick, and you want to have your last point line up roughly with one of the troughs or peaks from the waveform so you can get pretty good accuracy. And next thing you would do is drop this pretty low, and you want this to be pretty close to your last point, but not too much. If it's too close to your last point, your sidechain will be too strong and there will be silence between your kick and your main sound. So this is something you want to mess around with, and it's dependent on the main song. So let's see how this sounds. You can already see how that kick punches through a lot more, but it's a bit too much because it cuts out too much from this. So I would probably make the kick shorter, because if you just make your sidechain shorter without messing with your kick, the low frequencies from your kick will interfere with your sub. So if you're going to make your sidechain shorter, you also want to make your kick shorter. That's something you should always do. So around there. It's already a bit cleaner. That kick is still frontal and you can still hear that main sound pretty well. Next thing I'm probably going to want to cover is common EQing things. So like, let's say we want to add a random ARP in the background. So like we would take the main chords, put them here, and take an arpeggiator. Basically for the Ableton users, what arpeggiator does is it takes a chord and it basically turns it into an ARP. Oh man, it's not playing anything because I don't have an instrument on it. Okay, so we have our little ARP. Let me just make a quick little ARP real quick because we're not really covering sound design in this lesson, so I'm just going to make something real quick. Okay, so we have a little ARP, but usually you really want one or two or fewer, like around one, two, or three elements taking up your high end. Otherwise, you're going to have super painful high end, which is actually something I used to struggle with. So, for instance, if you have a sound that has a bunch of high end that doesn't really need it, you want to cut it off at around the area where you think it doesn't need much. So, for instance, I want the high end to be coming from these chords and these chords only. So, what I would do is I would take the high end from the ARP and I would probably cut it off just a tiny bit. And that's actually something you want to do for a lot of sounds. You want to cut off frequencies that it doesn't really need. So, another thing, for an ARP, you also want pretty much everything below, pretty much everything below 600, and an ARP you really don't need. Because ARPs tend to be a mid, high-end background element, and you don't really want ARPs taking up low-end. Unless you really want to, for like it being frontal. But if you're gonna have a background ARP, you really want to cut out the stuff over here because you really don't need it.
I think dissecting one of your songs would be a good thing to do as well.
Structuring. Structuring is really not something you can...
That would be good for dissecting, though.
Yeah, dissecting, I would probably dissect one of my songs to do that. But structuring is not really something you can teach for like technical stuff because there's not like a set formula for it. It's really about feeling it, and it's really all about feeling, knowing the music, knowing the feel you want to go for. It's basically comes from, like, personally, this is how I got the feel for flow, is to just listen to a lot of music. You'll hear lots of patterns you like, and you can, like, splice some of them together, take certain rhythms from different ones, splice those together, see if you can make up your own pattern. That's what I would probably say about making your own patterns for drops. It's really just something that comes with time.
I was going to say, as somebody that doesn't know what they're talking about at all, I feel like that's where, like, a lot of your creativity is meant to come from.
Yeah.
Like, you're building the song, structuring at that point is, you're the one building the track. That's really something you should be figuring out. It's
personal. There's no technical set rules, I mean, other than besides basic music theory and, like, 4/4, make sure you're in the right key, make sure you're using the correct number of beats in each measure, like, yeah, basically.
Even that, people have successfully broken.
Yeah, you know, like polyrhythm, for example. But again, you don't want to break the rules until you've mastered them. Just listen to music. Just really all I can say, listen to a lot of music, and it'll come to you eventually. So what I'm going to do now is open up one of my tracks. I'm actually going to open an unreleased track. Okay, so this is a currently unreleased track of mine. The mixing and sound design are kind of done, but whatever. I'm kind of going to show you how I went about doing the structure in this, specifically in the drop, because I feel like that's probably the most complex thing for structuring. Basically, want to have a few things in mind. You want to have, like, what you want your main phrase to be. Like, for instance, it would be this main sustained triplet thing. And you also want to throw some fills in. It could be like a filler bass or a vocal fill, a melodic fill. Placement of those is something that will, again, come with time. Once you've listened to a lot of music, you'll get a sense for where to put things and why. I'm going to go ahead and show you what I did in this track to show you how, like, what my mindset was for making this. So the first thing I did in this drop was, like, okay, I thought, okay, I want to have a fake out, but I also wanted to go for a little bit too long. So what I did is I made this bass pattern. So yeah, basically when it comes to making drops, I just start a pattern and just build from there. But anyway, I wanted to have a fake out, so I had this fake out with no drums. And yeah. Usually if you want to fake out, you tend to want to make that around 2 bars or so. You can make it around 4 bars, but you want to have either 1 bar or an even number for a fake out. So, like, for this instance, it's 2 bars.
You know what we have to do?
And then I have an impact bass. That's another thing for structuring. You tend to want to have an impact bass. You don't just want to go straight into your main bass pattern that you want people to focus on. Like for instance, it would be this thing. Like you can't just go straight from,
You know what we have to do?
and just go straight into that. You want to have some sort of contrast between those things, and you can bridge between them with an impact. So like for instance, I wanted this to be kind of like an empty thing to kind of bring you back and push you back in again. So I wanted there to be like a one bass and nothing else. So that's exactly what I did. It's just
That's
and
common
nothing
in a
else.
lot of genres too.
Yeah.
Like house music does that a lot too. It's a very common thing.
Yeah, that's a pretty good technique. And you can see at the end of every bar or so, I have a fill. That's something you can do, but you want to be careful with that because, again, you want to make sure you have a consistent feel. You want to be mindful of what your song sounds like as a whole.
Now you're
So, like, yeah, for this I have one main phrase that keeps repeating, and at the end of each bar, I have a fill. Actually, it's at the end of every 2 bars in this. One thing that I like to do is after the... How many bars is this?
It's 8 bars.
Yeah, what I do is I like to divide my drop into chunks. So, like, this would be the
Part
first
A and
chunk.
part B.
And,
That's what it's most
part A and part
commonly
B.
called.
I tend to, like, for example, this would be the A section, which is, like, the main part. And I tend to make my B section, like, a mutated version of the first section. So, like, you'll see that it's just, like... It still has that sustained triplet, but I did the same thing over here, but I made the sound design a little screechier and a bit higher frequency. That's something I like doing a lot because it brings up the energy further from the first half. And I also have fills much more frequent in this area than over here, which, for the same purpose, higher energy. Another good structure tip, you can kind of do that chunk thing in smaller segments, kind of like this. Like, you can see that I have like an A section right here. And then it changes. And then it goes back to the first one again. And then it goes to a new one. That's something I like to do a lot, is to have like A, B, A, C for like 4 bars. It's a common pattern. I use A, B, A, C for 4 bars. What else is there to go over?
You could say, I'd say maybe your beginnings and stuff and how you transition from one part of the other. Because
Oh, man.
I think you touched on energy very well, and I think
Yeah.
it'd be helpful if you could help explain to people how you would have low energy beginning, what you would do to bring energy into the verse and transition
something,
from what. I see you have a lot of symbols and stuff.
Yeah, for intros and midsections, that's actually something I haven't quite mastered yet. But for bridges and builds, I feel like I'm decent at that, and it's pretty well done in this bridge and build. I tend to have one part before the midsection, which is like, for instance, this would be the midsection. It's like this super good energy, lots going on, lots of sub, lots of elements. I tend to have one part before the build that's a little calmer and kind of gives the listener a break before going into the build. So, like, for instance, there's not much sub in this part. Actually, well, yeah, there's technically sub, but there's no drums in this part except for one at the halfway point. And obviously, you can't just have a sudden shift from a calm part like that into a super intense build. So you want some way to transition between that. You can achieve that with, like, putting some filter, like automating a filter or something. You can do it by adding a gap or with a sample or something with nothing else to kind of create a sense of transition between 2 parts, which is actually what I did here. I have one bar that's just nothing but a vocal sample. And then it just goes straight into this heavy build, which is not done yet. And also for transitioning between parts, I also tend to add reverse effects like reverse impact, reverse cymbals, reverse effects, and like something to cleanly bring one part into another so it just doesn't have silence and there's instantly a lot of noise. That's something you want to avoid unless you know exactly what you're doing with that. But I would say for transitioning from a bridge to a build, I would definitely have some kind of reverse effects, bringing that energy up and also cleanly bringing that in there. This is another thing that really only applies to heavy music, but you don't really want to have any sense of progression in your drop. Like you don't want to have a chord progression, you don't want to have a continuous melody. So you want to have like a static idea, like one chord, one arp, or one alternating thing.
That varies between genres, by the way. That's important to point out.
Yeah, like I said, this really only applies to heavy stuff. Like for future bass, they do progressions and builds all the time, but
That's what the genre builds off of. It
Yeah.
lives off of progression and house and stuff.
yeah.
Genres are very different and subjective.
And you also want to make sure your build is around 8 to 16 bars, some sort of factor of 8. Because anything shorter doesn't really bring the energy up enough through a long period of time, so you want it to be at least 8 bars. Right, wait, actually, how long is this? Yeah, you want to have your build at least 8 bars. 16 is okay sometimes, but again, you want to know exactly what you're doing with that. Another thing you want to do, you want to, I wouldn't recommend just immediately having your build instantly go into your drop. You want to have kind of like the way you have a gap or some sort of fill right before your bridge and your build. You want to do something similar in your drop, or at least that's what I like to do. Some people go instantly, but I personally don't like to. This little fill before your drop can also vary in sizes. Like, I think in lots of rhythm, the pre-drop bar will actually be like a solid 2 bars, which is interesting. Like, you can really get creative with the length of your pre-drop, but you don't really want to go anything over 2 bars. Like, some people will use half a bar, some people will use 1 full bar, some people will use 2. But yeah, the whole goal of your pre-drop is to like introduce your drop. Like you want something huge and energetic, like a huge scream vocal or something iconic that will give your track like an identity. That's basically what your pre-drop does, is it identifies your track. It's what people at shows will shout whenever they hear the track. So yeah, like your pre-drop is the golden key for making a good track. Oh, another thing that applies to super heavy stuff, especially for heavy rhythm, heavy dubstep, for drops, I tend to aim my sub to be around the volume, around 5 or 6, sometimes 2 or 3 if I want to go really heavy. But you want your sub in your mid sections and builds to be a lot quieter than your drop, because you don't want to have the energy spoiled in your first section. You want all of the main energy coming from your drop. I mean, you do want to have some energy, of course, but you want to have that big, full, super thick sub. You want to save that for the drop, because that's where, that's basically like the climax of your track. You don't want super big, dramatic events like a drop in the middle of your midsection, intro, or bridge, and that's especially true for sub. For effects, that's not quite as true. You probably do want more going on for effects in your intro, which is also something I'm struggling with, so take that with a grain of salt.
I will say, because you said you struggle with the whole effects thing,
Yeah.
one thing to keep in mind that I like to do for like intros and stuff is try and give your song an identity, because there's a saying I heard that I think is really good, and it's that a lot of people can tell by listening to only the first 5 to 10 seconds of your song if it's going to be good or not.
Yeah.
And it all goes to how well you can convey your idea, or you can create an environment, or just create something cohesive and mix down, and it all goes down to...
Yeah, that's kind of like, I'm sure some of you have heard like Some of you have taken writing classes or something like that. Like you want a hook in your thesis or something. It's pretty similar with music. You want something in your intro that catches the listener's attention, that makes them want to listen to the rest of it. Because if you have a super boring intro, chances are people aren't going to listen to the rest of it. So, yeah, John has a pretty good point with that. I guess that's really all I have to say. There isn't really much that I can say that I could say that isn't super advanced. So I guess that's really all I have to say for this for today. So I guess I'll see y'all next time, and thank y'all for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Ry, for teaching, and we'll hopefully be doing another one here in a week or so, ideally within the month.
All right, look forward to seeing y'all. I hope I've been helpful, and I'll see y'all next time. See you guys.